In our next interview, we meet Professor Paul OToole, who is an expert in the area of age related deterioration in the microbiome and also age related diseases and how they are interconnected in relation to overall human health and longevity.
Well, what actually happened was the government of Ireland launched a call in 2007 for research proposals in this new area of the microbiome. And one of the areas they targeted was the aging consumer because there was a suspicion that the Irish industry might be well placed to develop foods which targeted the microbiome. And that was incredibly prescient back in 2007, and credit to the Department of Agriculture and Food and the Health Research Board for having that foresight to launch that call. So I led the initiative which led to the ElderMet project, and we became one of the original microbiome centres in Europe and the world, actually. I didn't know what to expect, and we had a reasonably sized cohort of people in Cork City who were living in different areas. They were living at home, buying their own food, or they were living in long term residential care. And I didn't anticipate their microbiome would be very different. It's a small city in the western edge of Europe, but we discovered to our surprise that people living in their own homes and buying their own food had a much better microbiome than did people living in long-term residential care. And it wasn't driven by being in one particular centre. It was a feature of several places where we looked at long-term residential care, and it transpired over years of further research that the low diversity microbiome in these people was being driven by their relatively limited diet. Nutritional diversity is extremely important, and I think people probably instinctively realize that if their plate is beige and boring, it's probably not good for you. But by the same token, if it's entirely green and you're eating broccoli and nothing else, it's not good for you. So, diversity of food ingredients is important, and it leads to diversity of the microbiome and different metabolic or biochemical activities which the microbes can then pass on beneficially to you. Again, fortunately, this is something people can rationalize because we all know that not all of our older friends and relations age at the same rate or display age related health loss at the same rate. You meet spry 80-year-olds who are playing golf or fishing every day, and you meet 65-year-olds who have unfortunately succumbed to frailty, loss of energy, inflammatory diseases. So basically, your loss of physiological resilience, which means breakdown of your body systems, can proceed at different rates. Some of it you can control, and some of it you cannot. And we think that the microbiome is one of these environmental factors which contributes to the rate at which you experience this unwanted aging-related health loss. The ones we've been studying most intensively are frailty, inflammation, and cognitive function. So, frailty is a compound index which sums up lots of sensible, obvious things like do you have enough energy to get dressed? Do you have a good sense of balance? Combination of coordination and eyesight? Is your memory good enough to compose a shopping list? Get down to the store on foot or by car or by bicycle, and essentially live independently. And if you have loss of energy, coordination, balance, physical weakness, or inflammation, arthritis in major joints, where any of those functions are difficult or impossible, you will become more frail and you'll be less capable of independent living. Inflammation means the state of activity of your immune system. People think inflammation means if I have a bee stinger, if I hit my thumb with a hammer, it's inflamed. Well, that's true. But inflammation in a scientific sense means is my immune system turned on all the time chasing shadows, or is it in a state of readiness, ready to react to my next COVID vaccine or a mild gastroenteritis I get on holidays? So we want the immune system to be in a state of readiness, not running around chasing shadows. I think where you're heading with this question, Fergus, is in reference to the social microbiome and the important element of how people live. Um, I think, ironically, as I've interacted with gerontologists around Europe, what we're aiming for, the best community for an older person is living in a city block where they can walk around, go to the grocery store, go to the post office, go to the bank, go to the bridge club, go to the park, and walk a couple of miles around the block and have an interaction with their peers. And what we're essentially planning on paper is restoration of villages that we all lived in since the Middle Ages, but which have become more difficult to achieve when people live in admittedly comfortable but sanitized apartment blocks. So social contact is important. And increasingly, when we don't have multi generational families, people living alone, you tend to have elderly people who don't enjoy the transmission of microbes from their peers and from their children and their grandchildren, which is an important element in maintaining the microbiome. That's a brilliant question and a very challenging one because, as you rightly pointed out, as we get old, we're more at risk for diseases like cancer, type 2 diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease. And it takes complex statistics and large numbers of subjects to be able to figure out what happens if people age in a normal way without those diseases, what happens to their microbiome if they get those diseases, and how we can control for those. And in our latest study of 2,500 people around the world, we were able to separate out the different contributions of aging alone from the disease specific signatures in those major aging related diseases. And there are independent microbiome signatures of both. And knowing that means that we can now study aging and those diseases with more precision, with a greater chance of intervening once we know what the mechanism is. We've been able to establish that it's actually a mixture of both. So to put this into some sort of context, there are three major groups of microorganisms. Desirable, helpful organisms, which we call commensals, which we call group 1. They tend to be replaced by other less helpful commensals, which we call group 2. And then there are a third group of organisms which, under the right circumstances, are associated with the disease. And these are so-called pathobionts. With healthy aging, we see an inevitable loss of group 1 organisms and replacement with these group 2 organisms, which aren't good but aren't overtly bad. Whereas in the case of unhealthy aging, we see a blossom of the third group of so-called pathobionts, and that's what we're trying to target and prevent occurring to extend healthy aging. We can. We have very good indices. These indices have been established, researched intensively on both sides of the Atlantic, and we have a couple of competing indices, but they're hard measures with good scientific robustness behind them. We have done interventions where we've given people around Europe a Mediterranean diet. And this was a very ambitious experiment which could only have been funded by the European Union. And it involved 1,250 people, 250 subjects in each of 5 European cities. And we deliberately recruited pre-frail subjects who were expected to further decline over the course of 1 year. And what we saw, we divided them in half. The individuals who were given a Mediterranean diet for 1 year maintained a health-related microbiome and had better measures for the health indices I mentioned earlier on, namely inflammation, frailty, and cognitive function. And they had a correspondingly good microbiome. Whereas without that med diet, people's health stats continued to decline and their microbiome also declined. And now what we're hoping to do is twofold. First of all, we want to simplify a med diet into ingredients that we could administer in a simpler form, perhaps as a convenient food. And we'd also like to develop these therapeutic microbes, which they seem to need, so we can supplement the microbiome in people for whom dietary intervention may not be possible. I'm not a believer in extending lifespan indefinitely. I think there's a finite end to human life which we should respect and which is physiologically, medically impossible or ill-advised to try and extend. But as opposed to that, I think extending health span, the current mortality death age in Ireland is around 80, 85 for women. People can become centenarians, but they may have an overwhelming burden of illness by that time and may not be living very productive lives. But what's really attractive is to try and alleviate the burden of health and maintain health span so people are not just alive, but they're also enjoying life and contributing productively to society. I think we've never been in a better position to do that because for the first time we understand some of the key environmental variables. And again, I always recognize the fact that you have things like genetics and previous lifestyle exposures and experiences which you can't ameliorate. But everything else being equal, I think the diet microbiome link offers a really powerful lever for improving health span at the moment.